Hi, and welcome to In the Pod. My name is Sarah Gillborn. I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham.
And I'm Tom Delahunty from the Department of Education in Maynooth University.
Yeah, and we are here today to discuss our published paper, which is called The Psychological Complex in Contemporary Education Policy. So I think the first thing we'll talk about is kind of the journey into the paper, including kind of how we met and also the conversations we had that led to the development of this paper. As I said, I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham. I started at Birmingham in 2021. And my research and teaching focus is very much in critical psychology, which is what this paper draws on, as well as network governance, which we will talk about. So I teach critical psychology. I've got a third-year option module at undergrad that's dedicated to critical psychology. And I'm kind of talking with students in that module about dominant assumptions in psychology, dominant approaches, and being critical of those and kind of thinking about the knowledges and ideas that are left out with dominant approaches to psychology. And I'm also teaching on a psychology in education course. So the students are thinking about psychology in the context of education. And in my critical module, we're thinking about the implications of dominant psychology in education, how it influences policy. And this is all really relevant to this paper. And I met you, Tom, because you were at the University of Birmingham as well.
Yeah, I started actually around the same time as you. It was 2021 as well. I only lasted a year though.
COVID as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was during COVID. Yeah. God, that seems. Yeah. So I would have been there in 2021 as well, and I departed in 2022, and we were working on the same program, both being psychologists, and I've slowly come to think of myself, I think, as a critical psychologist as well, with regards the approach I take to the deconstruction of mainstream psychology and its effects in education. So I would generally be quite interested in the politics and policy of education, and particularly from a critical psychological, post-structuralist, post-humanist perspective. And I also try to adopt decolonial approaches in my own research and my own theorizing around this as well. And similar concerns to you in that I have deep concerns about, number one, the dominance psychology has attained in mainstream educational discourse and scholarship. And also, I think the manner in which it has constructed certain visions that we have for education, and even going a little bit beyond that, certain visions we have for childhood, adolescence, and students that ultimately teachers deal with. So when I was at Birmingham, we both worked on the psychology and education program. But in the Irish context where I am now, it's teacher education. And that's primarily what I'm on. So what I'm primarily teaching is foundational modules for some of our teacher ed programs in sociology of education and the psychology of education. With the psychology of education, I do tend to take a kind of a critical approach to teaching a lot of these mainstream concepts. And we've lately launched funded educational psychology doctorate, which is only weeks in, and I'm lucky to be teaching on that because, well, we think it's quite a different approach to educational psychology than the mainstream kind of, I don't want to get into trouble by saying it too loudly, but the mainstream kind of, neo-positivist type conceptions that we have from generally, I think it's fair to say, and we probably will say, and we have said in the paper, the kind of overly positivist construction of mainstream psychological discourse, methods, research. So that's something I was concerned with, or we were concerned with, regards how educational psychology is treated. And then obviously with these people going out to work with people with complex needs and things like that, where the mainstream approach can be quite alienating. So I'm rambling a little bit now, and I'm sorry, but so part of what I'm teaching on that at the moment, and it is brand new, is on a theory of educational psychology module, and in that I'm actually teaching a little bit on critical psychology specifically, so the politics of psychology in education, and the way it's manifested in sociocultural discourse, political discourse, and how it's impacted on educational policy, which is also what we're talking about here. But yeah, and so like that's where you and I met, and the University of Birmingham. So I departed about 12 months after that, but we have remained in contact, and you know, I think it's fair to say friends.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So that's kind of where the paper came about from. Is we have, like, as often as we can, kind of regular catch-ups and talk about all sorts of things, including work and politics and psychology's role in that, and also other things that aren't always related to that. But this paper was born out of kind of several of those conversations where we were talking about scientism in psychology, the kind of positivist dominance in psychology, and especially from our perspectives as kind of educators, like talking about, and that comes up in the paper, is this dominance of positivism in psychology training that students undergo. And especially as at Birmingham, I am and you were teaching people who, some wanted to be educational psychologists, some want to be teachers, but all of them are interested in using psychology in education. But often what people are learning about on psychology degrees is, positivist, often quite reductionist knowledge. And we see this in education policy in terms of, it's not just something that's within psychology itself, but in the kind of policy sphere, policy is increasingly being informed by psychology, particularly because it's seen as this objective insight into how people work and how people learn. But one of the things we talk about in the paper, and one of the frustrations that we had that, we were talking about and developed it into this paper, was that thinking about people and schooling in those ways where we're just reducing it down to kind of individual cognition or intelligence even, really removes an ability for us to talk about systemic inequalities in education, and very much kind of allows the status quo to continue unchallenged, if we're only thinking about, individuals' abilities and how we can help those to prosper without thinking about the context they sit in. And I think it's fair to say we're both frustrated that those contexts aren't things that psychology students are often kind of encouraged to learn about. And those kind of positivist knowledges aren't contextualized in that way. Like, it's just presented as, this is how you do psychology, rather than this is one way of studying people and schooling and children and young people. But there's also these other contexts that are really important to their experiences that they're not learning about. And that's something that kind of drove our critical engagement that we picked up on in this paper.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, like, there's obviously deep concerns that we both share for how it silences systemic issues, because of the way it's constructed itself as a discipline, particularly that abstract kind of distanced notion of science, which is bogus, But on top of that, I would add that not only does it ignore systemic issues, but it constructs certain visions of what an individual looks like because of its individualized focus. So it doesn't just, as a science, function to uncover the truth of who we are as human beings. And I think, if you're taking a Foucauldian or a Deleuzian line towards the idea of subjectivity, you'd realize that. And I think, Deleuze actually wrote about this in Difference and Repetition and that before, about the fact that it doesn't just, uncover a truth, and, it goes back to that Foucault's notion around truth and what is truth and regimes of truth. But also, from that Deleuzian perspective, he would have argued about how it actually imposes a particular frame on how we understand the individual, which is this really narrow conception. And then later on, when Erica Berman wrote about it, then in terms of the textualization of childhood and stuff, and the way it constructs certain visions of the ideal child, but which actually, in constructing those discourses, because childhood is such an emotive and kind of loaded terminology and construction in socio-cultural world, it actually helps to also perpetuate those systemic hierarchies and inequalities, by imposing them onto a supposedly natural idea of childhood. And of course, that natural idea of childhood is always white, it's always Western, it's always, at the expense of the global South, and inherently tied and supportive and contributive to neoliberal capitalism. So, it works kind of in that manner in a number of ways, but it does absolutely silence the systemic issues. And then I think part of those logics is that it constructs this vision of the individual. And of course, you mentioned it there about how, psychology has gone beyond the field of psychology into, well, in our case, we're concerned about education and educational policy, but I mean, it is the psychologization of life as well. And how we come to know ourselves, and that is part of this psych complex. It's presented as the way of knowing our true selves, which of course denies the many and multiple ways, or the multiplicities in which we can be plural subjects and adopt plural subjectivity. So I think it works it has a number of insidious tactics like that.
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the kind of key concepts in the paper, is the psi complex, and that's a term we use picking up on people who've come before us in terms of kind of talking about not just psychology but psi disciplines like psychiatry and others that kind of come together to produce patterns and assumptions of what we think people are, who we think people should be, and how we think people should behave. And the psi complex also kind of recognizes the use of those discourses and assumptions within existing kind of power structures. So exactly as you said, how it reinforces the idea of focusing on individuals, changing individuals' behavior to fit them into the expectations that exist, rather than thinking about the structures and context around individuals.
And also, as you rightly point out, with calling back to this, like psi disciplines and psychiatric power, like Alain Foucault and stuff. And then, Nicholas Rose takes it on the psychiatric gaze as part of contemporary governance. But one of the things to point out as well is it's not just about an intent to uncover truth, an intent to uncover our true selves or give us the means by which we can understand our true selves. It's to explicate a construction of the self that can be governed within that larger system and complex of neoliberal capitalism. And I think that's the core point and how it links into educational policy, is that the psychologization of education within policy becomes a technology of governance.
Yeah, this is one of the things we linked it with in the paper in terms of this increase in research, and particularly funding towards research that focuses on things like social emotional learning, things like grit and those kind of things that are being
resilience, right?
Resilience, is a big one, and that did come up in our kind of analysis of Ofsted's materials. So that's where this was kind of informed by, was we were thinking about scientism, the psi complex and its influence in education policy. And there's previous literature that we've kind of gone through in that paper thinking about SEL, grit, resilience, and also the funding that's put towards research of that nature. And when we think about research on, institutional racism in education, sexism in education, these things are much less likely, especially from a non-psychological point of view, much less likely to receive funding. And we and others argue that that's because focusing on grit, resilience, SEL, social emotional learning, these all position the individual as the thing that needs to be kind of monitored, changed, adapted into the system, which is working fine and is working as it should. And research that kind of supports that idea is, heavily funded, whereas kind of contextual research looking at systemic inequalities in education is much less likely to be. And this is, part of what drew our attention to education policy, because of our understanding of the kind of patterns of research in the area that is prioritized and privileged in comparison to that isn't. And that maybe links us into the network governance aspect of the paper as well.
Before you dive into that, I'm not sure if we did it or not, because I was, we were just going, but I think it might be helpful to maybe define for the audience, because I know we are using a lot of terms there, is the psi complex itself, because I know we spent a bit of time going back and forth about that.
Yeah, for sure. So the psi complex I'm going to use exactly the wording that we use in the paper so that this is clear. But by the psi complex, we mean the collection of assumptions about the individual, personal responsibility, and social relations that psychology and psi disciplines provide. So the psi complex is this collection of assumptions about individuals and personal responsibility. And when we describe psychology as being part of the psi complex, it's recognizing it as a science that serves the purposes of the powers that be to define a grid of understanding that helps to position people into a certain system of governability. And that is as defined by Nichol and Morse.
Yeah.
So that is what we're talking about when we talk about the psi complex. So it's a collection of assumptions and also a system of governance and the application of kind of what is regarded as, objective positivist science to those kind of systems of governance.
Yeah, and heavily scientific in nature, not science-based, and particularly how, and I wrote about that in a previous publication about the onset of scientism as, particularly in late-stage capitalism and the way it has structured, the context of policy within liberal democracies. So it's not, and we're not arguing for the psi complex or scientism pre-existing each other. The fact is that there is the notion of scientism, heavily feeds the psi complex. The psi complex heavily imputes notions of scientism within the social sciences. So, so we're not arguing for one or the other. It's a combination.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is something that in the paper we talk about how it's not just, and I think we've already referenced this kind of point, but especially kind of from my perspective as a psychologist who teaches critical approaches to psychology, I often think about this in the context of within psychology, and this is something we'll pick up on later as well when we talk about kind of future directions. But within psychology, when I'm talking to, future psychologists, I want them to be thinking about the context that people are living within as well and thinking outside of the kind of box of the self. But it's not just within psychology that these perspectives are kind of privileged and prioritized. And yeah, as we've mentioned, in education policy, it's going to really annoy me because I can't remember his name, but there was the kind of a very big the head of education under the Conservative government. He was the longest reigning kind of education lead over the Conservative and Lib Dem government. Coalition government is the word I'm looking for, and the Conservative government when they led themselves. He was quoted very recently, I want to say in October, September, as having said that the education reforms that were overseen by the Conservative government during that period were not informed at all by education departments in universities, but instead they took instruction and suggestions from psychology departments. And the kind of arguments he was making seemed to me total evidence of what we are talking about in this paper, in terms of they don't want to use contextual, maybe sociological kind of research or even critical psychological research that takes into account context. They want actionable, positivist psychology research that very, is seen to straightforwardly locate the issue within individuals and give suggestions about how we can adapt and alter individuals to improve their educational experiences, essentially. And this relates to another kind of key aspect of this paper, where we were drawing on critical psychology, but also network governance, to talk about how there is a network of kind of policy actors who are encouraging, reinforcing the kind of dominance of psychology within education policy. So it's not just a kind of within psychology problem where we would want to talk to other psychologists about the importance of context, but it is a policy issue whereby it is psychology that is turned to for these policy answers, because it is seen to provide really straightforward, actionable answers to those questions, even though there is a huge amount of context and important information that those perspectives aren't taking into account by only looking to the individual. but there's this kind of network of policy actors that we wanted to kind of talk about in the paper that are kind of aiding the dominance of these psychology approaches in policy.
And I think also with network governance, it situates the work in more contemporary times with regards policy making, because policy making doesn't just occur now in, formal institutions. It is informed by, as you rightly point out, these really complex networks of state, non-state actors. In what we have seen, and it's a feature of capitalist society, the evolution of technology, the advent of social media, and all that goes with it, is obviously these kind of edu celebrities that exist as well. So it's not only that you have politicians, as you rightly point out, drawing on psychology and making these claims, you have these edu celebrities who are also driving discourse around that. So that not only affects the actual formal policy that is created, but it enforces a particular vision of policy enactment in schools as well, where teachers who are influenced by this and perhaps not aware or not engaged with the more critical take on psychology tend to think that these, and why wouldn't you, tend to think that these are best practices for working with kids or students or whatever. But and it's hard to blame them in an overcrowded system. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it kind of links back as well to people studying psychology as well. It's very much presented as this is the way to do psychology in terms of quantitative positivist literature and research. It's not. Yeah. It's not contextualized in the same way that qualitative research is. So that's something we talk about as well in terms of...
We do, because it was about, almost like bearing your sins on paper when you write about qualitative research, in terms of, you need to be reflexive, you need to do this, you need to admit your, it's what it is actually is the deficitizing of the qualitative approach in the nature of its comparison to the quantitative, hypothetical, deductive type approach. Yeah, and also, and we do mention it in there, although we don't go into terrible depth about it, but even that idea of the replication crisis is, rather than it being treated as a moment to reflect on how the discipline is framed in the mainstream, it's almost like a doubling down on the kind of a neo-positivist behaviorist model. We need more stringent controls in research. We need advanced, forecasting, advanced sample size, power calculations, all of this kind of stuff, rather than interrogating the actual onto-epistemologies of the discipline and its connection with issues of social injustice and inequality. And like, I know you've written on that in the past with regards even just the core whiteness of mainstream psychology curricula.
Yeah, that was another thing. It is in the paper, but doesn't reflect how much we've talked about the kind of replication crisis and the assumptions within that idea of it as a crisis. And exactly as you said, the kind of, rather than using it as an opportunity to reflect on what should psychology do and how, what should we be aiming to find or look for or study, instead it was a doubling down of we need more controls, it needs to be more positivist. The science needs to be better. Yeah.
And playfully, and I always do this talking to you and I talk to other people, it is really crisis in, inverted quotations, because, I view it as a distraction from the real problem.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So I think we'll also talk a little bit then about how we approached the paper and the kind of structure of it, which is going to pick up on some of what we've already talked about. In terms of it did start actually. So the main kind of analytical aspects of the paper are analysing the Ofsted inspection framework research report. So what that means is the inspection framework from Ofsted, which is the body that evaluates schools and learning environments in the UK, in England. They have criteria that they judge the quality of schools based on, and they release a research report which details the research that has informed that inspection criteria. So what we applied our analysis to was the research report that informs that, because we were interested in what research are they drawing on to inform their inspection framework, what assumptions does this research draw on, what's included, what isn't included, what are the implications of viewing things in these ways. The paper didn't start that way. It did start as a slightly broader examination of the psychomplex in education policy, and there were different examples. But what we found was that several of the examples, not all of them, but several of them were coming from Ofsted. And we thought focusing it on Ofsted as a key kind of player and influence in education policy and practice in England would be a good way to focus the argument, essentially. And that's important because we were talking before we started about applying this to the Ofsted research is just one way in which you could apply this.
Yeah, and I mean, even maybe while not explicitly critical psychological approach, I've definitely taken aspects of critical psychology in different, like broadly framed post-structural, post-humanist kind of ways that I've analysed different policies and discourses emerging from the likes of the OECD and particularly their education directorate. So even if you take not even, we'll say, national policy like Ofsted, but intergovernmental policy like the OECD, or even what's interesting, because we're obviously in the height of the AI era at the moment, is work by a colleague of mine, Audrey Bryan, that's taken a critical look at UNESCO policy, because UNESCO used to have that kind of image of itself as like the kind of the human conscience, almost the conscience in policy making, particularly when it comes to education. And that's not as true as, you know, as it seems. So in this, to take the example of the psychomplex, the OECD is heavily informed and aligned with that psychomplex as well, and that's on a global scale, particularly in its learning compass. And, you know, Ria Shahjahan has written about, you know, the inherent coloniality of the OECD and its tactics and strategies and its governance logics, and it does extend beyond that. It's not just a, you know, even when you look at, like, we'll call it the matrix of intelligibility. I think that's to borrow from Judith Butler, actually. You know, how we've come to understand education systems and the performance of education systems can almost be reduced to the OECD's focus on the standardized testing in PISA. And that in itself draws very highly on the psychomplex and the fact that you can quantify and scientifically measure and compare and differentiate different education systems without any contextual nuance, you know, is part of that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You can take the view that, or the kind of the theoretical viewpoint that we've taken with regards to this critical psychological adoption, and you could apply this to any any educational policy in the mainstream at the moment, because you will find inflections of that psychological complex in them.
For sure. Yeah. So it's education policy, but it's also policy across the board, where psychology is privileged as this objective kind of insight into humans. Why do they do what they do? So this was kind of our way of focusing this argument on education, and in a really informative and quite important piece of policy that's going to be informing how people understand education and also how they judge the quality of education. So by focusing on the Ofsted research report, this was essentially one way of many that we could have focused this argument.
And ultimately, in education, you know, is conceived in terms of its purpose, but also its enactment, you know, because obviously the purpose drives the enactment as well. But I mean, even we have excerpts in the paper around, you know, that are drawn from kind of that zero behaviour tolerance approach of, you know, exclusion is necessary in behavioural circumstance and things like that, where, you know, again, it's informed by the psychological conceptions of the individual, and that in itself is an inherently unjust practice that can therefore be recommended to be enacted in the actual schools. So there's the enactment piece as well, which is very concerning.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads on to maybe some key analyses in the paper, kind of key things that we picked out from the Ofsted.
And I think I think it's probably fair to say themes, you know, I mean, if we're to borrow that research perspective, I mean, we did uncover a number of themes that are, informed or motivated by that psych complex. So
Yeah, for sure. And I think a common theme through all of it was this focus on individuals. Their resilience was a specific one that had attention paid to it, and we linked that back to psychology. Resilience is a psychological concept, I think is correct to say. The APA, the American Psychological Association, gives kind of definitions of it, explains it's something that can be transformed. But then we're also, evaluating the extent to which, who are we asking to be resilient in education? What are we asking them to be resilient against? And, some of the things that we analysed in the research report were referring to, they never mentioned inequalities explicitly. There was no reference to racism or sexism, but there were references to, resilience might be more important for, I don't want to get wrong what group they mentioned, but certainly they mentioned, children from disadvantaged backgrounds may need to be more resilient. But what's happening here is that those children need to, build resilience, which takes time and takes effort and, cognitive processing. But what isn't challenged is that these children are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, and the disadvantage itself is allowed to remain, but those children need to be supported to be more resilient against those aspects.
And it simultaneously distracts from those systemic issues, but also it essentially reduces it down to, buck up, chin up.
Pull yourself up. Try again.
And it is that Kathleen Lynch writes very well on it in Care and Capitalism, that self-responsibilization attitude, as you rightly point out. It's, in individualizing the issues, it does two things. It assigns the blame in individuals. Well, if you're suffering from your disadvantage, you can develop resilience to be okay with that. And the other side of it is, if you don't develop resilience to that, it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no, and this again was another theme, was that there was no recognition that, there was kind of this mention of they need to be resilient if they're from disadvantaged backgrounds, but no recognition that there's evidence to suggest that children from working class backgrounds are graded lower and have lower expectations of them from teachers. Black children have lower expectations. And it's almost, it feels as though children are being asked to be resilient against those expectations that they have and the treatment that they receive. Not just, it feels sometimes like the resilience argument is that there's an acknowledgement that these children will encounter, classism, racism, but not necessarily in the school, but it still affects them and they need to be resilient against it. But there's this lack of acknowledgement that exists within schools, and not just from individuals, from peers, teachers, but within the structures of schooling itself. And again, those are allowed to go unchallenged and remain as they are. And it's the children that must be resilient against those structures.
Absolutely. And, my thought there actually, as we're talking about this, is, I think to like Carl Kitching's work as well, and some work that I wrote previously on this, which, along with that, along with obviously the neoliberalization of social life, but particularly in our case, the neoliberalism that's affected education, is the notion that educational spaces have become depoliticized. That schools in themselves, and you hear it in broader discourse now about politics having nothing to do with education, or should have nothing to do with education. When in fact the very nature of education is always a political act as well. If you think about like Henry Giroux writes on it, there's an inherent political element to education, in itself, and like that's drawing from that critical pedagogy perspective of Paulo Freire and those as well. So I think it's important to, I think, highlight that, because it's also in many ways showing how the psi complex's effect in educational policy still feeds into that whole neoliberalization of education and supports those continuing logics by depoliticizing the educational space.
Yeah, exactly. This also, brings me to the argument we make that, and this links back to the conservative person who'd been talking about not being informed by education department research, he'd explained that education research in the kind of education discipline was too ideological. And one of the things we challenge in this paper is the idea that the decision to only use positivist research is itself an ideological decision.
Yeah.
So that, he was really clearly, I will find it while we're talking so I can bring it up, but he was really clearly talking about, education research was ideological. It was hard to kind of turn into action, but psychology departments were giving research that were actionable, objective. And having worked in both psychology departments and education departments, I understand that what he's arguing there is that the psychology research is positivist and the education research is often not. But deciding that one of those is more valuable than the other is an ideological decision, but it's being presented as, but they're numbers, it's positivism, so this is objective, this is science, this is what it should be. But that is an ideological decision in and of itself. And that was one of the things that we wanted to emphasize as well.
We did, and I'd go further to say that psychology is in itself inherently ideological anyway. And it's not, the thing about it is it likes to claim it's not. It likes to claim that it has the objective moral ground in that sense. But it is an inherently ideological position. I'm trying to recall, there was a chapter I read by Anthony Williams about, and I can remember it very clearly because it had a really catchy title. It was "Are We All Psychologists Now?" And he did talk explicitly about the ideology of psychology, and it's a very good indication of how psychology operates within these discourses. And he talks about especially education, because essentially by drawing on psychology, within educational scholarship, we'll say, we are using psychology as a discursive construct to explain something. So because we have a psychological explanation of, say, let's say inherent intelligence differences, right? We've now determined that a particular intervention leads to certain gains or whatever in a spatial ability test. I'm just picking this off the top of my head, by the way, in case anyone's wondering about me being, overly precise or anything. But like, for example, there is a well-known body of research that looks at the link between spatial cognition as measured with psychometric type measures and mathematics performance, for example. And there are several authors out there that have claimed that this is the explanation for inherent gender differences that we see in different educational systems when it comes to mathematics performance, with females performing less and all that. And I often think of Anthony Williams' chapter here because it's an ideological type construction, in the sense that this psychological explanation built by a psychological approach to research in this educational context acts as a discursive representation, a discursive kind of construction to explain the causality of this issue. But in acting as a discursive construction, it's actually masking, or standing in for a discursive fact. And the problem with that, of course, is it absolutely renders the inherent inequalities and the service to power that psychology plays, it renders that opaque. So we draw on psychology, and as an idea, it kind of explains away any particular issues of power or systemic bias or things like that. I hope that's making sense. Sorry, because I am kind of rambling now a bit. But
no, I've got you. So it operates as, it presents its knowledges as kind of objective and
as fact, like it operates as
this is the truth. Yeah. And in doing that, it takes away any kind of recognition that in itself is an ideology, that there are other things that are going on for people that have an impact on how we choose to measure things, how we do the analysis, the questions that we ask in research. Someone's performance on a task might be impacted by other things. And all of that is ignored when we focus on, but we have a measure which is predetermined and validated, and we're making a connection between that and this, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So it masks itself as a fact, as a discursive fact, but it's actually a discursive construction.
Right, for sure. Yeah.
And of course, it's a very, like, if you take that context in particular, it absolutely takes away from the fact that, mathematics as a subject is inherently constructed with particular gendered and sexed representations.
Yeah.
It takes away from the fact that, in its service, like even the idea of STEM education and its service to the economy and neoliberal capitalism, masks the fact that is itself built on gendered, racialized, and sexed grounds as well.
Yeah. We can't remove these, so taking maths as the example, you can't remove maths from the subject or from the context of girls often hear that girls are worse at maths. Yeah. And we know that hearing that has an impact on girls' performance in maths, or can have an impact on girls' performance in maths. Absolutely. So psychology can sometimes serve to reproduce assumptions about inherent gender differences, and in reproducing those assumptions actually recreates those gender differences in some observations.
Yeah, absolutely. So like finding that the way to address gender differences, for example, in that subject, is to train spatial ability, which we can train narrow forms of it, I suppose, and that's what a certain body of research out there does. We're taking away from the fact, we're masking it as an explanation and a solution, whereas in fact we're not dealing with the gendered, classed, racialized basis of these issues, which remain, and which because of that are actually being recrystallized, as you point out.
Yeah, exactly. And that links into probably one more thing I'd want to highlight from our analysis that I think we've tapped into, but maybe just not explicitly stated, is that so much of the research informing the Ofsted inspection framework positions children in a deficit perspective. Yeah. So the problem is the children, their resilience, their motivation, their knowledge, rather than anything structural that might be impacting their ability to be resilient or their engagement in education. And bullying was something that came up briefly, but not thought of as something that can be a product of kind of structural inequalities, but rather just very much, when bullying was mentioned, it was positioned as, bad apples, kind of some children are mean, and seeing it as kind of an individual fault or personality failure rather than as something that could be reproduced through when we grow and live within systems that reproduce and normalize racism. Okay, right. So we're going to start to wrap up now, firstly by talking about what we think psychologists and people working in kind of education sphere can do with this, and kind of what we think impact would look like. I'd like to talk from the kind of psychologist side, or the psychologist kind of point of view, in terms of transforming how we think about psychology and how we engage with it. So I think there needs to be, and I and many others have been saying this for many years, many of them long before me, but I think there needs to be a real kind of reckoning with psychology and our engagement with it as psychologists, especially because I think I would hedge a bet and say that the majority of people go into a psychology, kind of a big motivation when you ask people when they go into it is they want to make people's lives better, they want to change the world for the better, and they want to improve things. And I think a lot of people do also have a kind of social justice orientation within psychology, whether it's in improving children's learning, their context, even outside of education. Most people in psychology, in one way or another, want to make people's lives better. I would encourage psychologists to think about how their research is used, how it can be used, and also thinking about the extent to which it considers the context of the people who are included in research. Like thinking about critically, are we separating people's processes, experiences from the wider context that they sit within? Is there, or are there ways that we can draw that back in, that we can emphasize to policymakers who pick up on research the importance of thinking about those contexts? I think it's important to think about how our research is being used, but also how we do research as well, and thinking about the things that we include in it. There's many suggestions for that. One of those that is perhaps more applicable to people in terms of practical applications is one that we talk about in the paper, which is called Quant Crit, which is critical. It's really about critical approaches to quantitative research, and does pick up on critical race theory in terms of thinking about racism as being central. But others have also kind of applied it to other issues of inequality, such as class, immigration as well. But it encourages us to think about our quantitative research, recognizing it as being political, as being inseparable from context, and thinking in more detail about how we do and analyze quantitative research. So how we measure data and different concepts, the impact that has, even down to how we kind of categorize different groups, how that can have an impact on the data that we find or the analyses that we're able to do. So particularly for people who are doing kind of quantitative research, I would really encourage engagement with kind of critical quantitative perspectives to think in more detail about them and reflect in more detail about that as well. And I think it relates to this importance of recognizing that all the research we do is inseparable from political context, whether we recognize and talk about those political contexts or not. The research is inseparable from those, and we need to think about those in more detail and talk about those and reflect on them in more detail as well.
And also that, it always struck me as a reading it like that, quantitative data is no less inherently constructed than qualitative data. And I think it's particularly important in the psychological tradition, because we tend to treat those things kind of, as a binary, quant good, qual bad, this kind of a approach. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and if I was to say what our takeaways are, so if we take it to the education context as well, and I'm not the first one to say this, to reaffirm, I think Michael Apple was one of the first who wrote about it, but the non-neutrality of educational policy, it is not a neutral instrument. It is an inherently political instrument, as is psychology, as is education. They are inherently political areas. The whole aspect of even being a person is political. So there is a necessity to reaffirm the politicalness of educational spaces, materials, curricula, policy, schooling. That it is an inherently politicized process. So trying to divorce it from the notion that it involves politics is just erroneous. So I think that's the first thing, is to be clear about that, and then also to take policy critically in that sense. So look at how it does construct particular visions of what education is, what the subject of education is. So when I mean subject, I mean the student or the child in this perspective. And to realize, I think, for teachers that in enacting policy, are we being cognizant of those things? For policymakers, it's to realize there is no divorcing politics from the creation of educational policy, and to realize how, without knowing the complex motivated constructions of educational materialities are inherently, problematic.
Yeah.
I think they would be my takeaways, and I'm never great at making practical outcomes from this kind of stuff, but I do think we need to be a little bit more critical about policy, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that is don't worry, because Nick Gibb, the longest serving education minister, would agree that we are less good at giving concrete outcomes. But I think with both these things, it's like, whether it's recognizing that policy is political and can't be divorced from politics, is actually, in my opinion, quite straightforward. For psychologists, I think a lot of psychologists, there's kind of this group of critical psychologists who kind of don't separate and can't separate psychology from politics. There are other psychologists quite further away from us in how we think about it, who think that actions to think about contexts and contextualize racism and sexism and other issues in education is actually counter to science. And then I think there's this huge group in the middle who think that this is really important work, but don't know where to start and don't feel that they have resources to be able to start. And I understand that and sympathise with that, especially now and the difficulties in higher education at the moment. But I think that there are things that people can do to practically apply these kind of understandings to their work. QuantCrit is one example, and there are others that we talk about in the paper too, in terms of Siam and Gaza's one that we reference in terms of using Black feminist epistemology within educational psychology. And there is advice out there in terms of practically applying these perspectives to psychology work, including quantitative psychological work. So the advice out there exists. And I think the tricky thing for psychologists, myself included, is that most of us have been trained and taught through positivist curricula. And it was I felt lucky where I studied psychology, shout out Leeds Beckett University, to have been taught by a lot of critical psychologists who introduced this to me early on. So I had at least the beginnings of being able to kind of apply these perspectives. But many people who have studied psychology, and it's not just in the UK, it is globally, aren't introduced to these ideas. So it is a little bit of having to it is a bit self-taught and having to kind of apply them, but the resources are out there. And also I would emphasize that it really is a global issue in terms of Makawi talks about how even the psychology that's taught in or was taught in universities in Palestinian territories were teaching this white Western positivist psychology because it's been imported that way. So it is a global problem in terms of psychology being really it's often defined as kind of psychology of human mind, brain and behaviour, but really it's a psychology of white, upper or middle class, non-disabled men's minds, brain and behaviour. And that's a problem that's been highlighted for years. And I feel like even psychology taught courses often mention that and do delve into that a bit, but then it's not kind of applied throughout, and that's a problem.
I think it is a typical psychological approach in a way, in that I actually think it was Ian Parker who wrote about this originally, the idea that, psychology approaches notions of complexity, so that being a complexity, but then moves on, so it's like, here's a really potentially complex issue, now let's look at something else. That kind of is the...
In studies with students that I've done, that is, the students notice. It's not good enough for us to say, oh, by the way, this researcher, this theorist was incredibly racist. On to the next point. It needs much deeper engagement and interrogation than that, and that's often not what is happening.
Playfully, it goes, eugenics was bad, but intelligence testing can be useful.
This is something that
beware of those assertions. And the other, I would absolutely concur with all of that. And I would say, you mentioned there about there's, it's like educating, but I think there's actually an element of uneducating yourself a little bit in psychology, because you had when you were studying your psychology, I came at it a different way then, in the fact that I was a teacher first, and then studied psychology later. So I really got the full, the mainstream version of psychology in my master's. But I would then have had a lot of conflicts with it afterwards personally, because of my engagement with those more post-structural, decolonial, post-human type theories that don't jar with the mainstream kind of positivist or neo-positivist model that we're given in our general psychological education. So there is an element of a kind of uneducating yourself from that, and realizing that the boundary of that institution, which we call psychology, is a lot more porous than you think. So I think it's to be brave enough to actually say, let's consider decolonial theory here. Let's consider taking a Deleuzian approach to subjectivity, instead of this, deficit-oriented ontologizing of the individual.
Sure.
So I do think it involves a bit of risk, but I do think, while I agree that critical psychologists are still in the minority in this sense, this has been written about for quite a while now. So hopefully it'll start to get a little bit more visibility.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I agree that it's unlearning as much as learning new
Unlearning.
perspectives, particularly if you've studied psychology at undergraduate level and not studied before things like sociology, for example, or other disciplinary perspectives.
Yeah.
You know, as critical psychologists, we are picking up on kind of other perspectives to help to inform our critical engagement with psychology. If you've not studied those before, there's an aspect of learning what are the other kind of ways of understanding this and other perspectives, but also definitely unlearning the kind of taken for granted assumptions that have been presented in particular ways in psychology education.
Yeah. And really, it's not that different to what we've, I suppose, well, I'm not going to say not that different because that's actually a bit disingenuous, but or a bit platitudinous even, but it's not different in the sense to developing that question orientation that we always, suggest that you would develop as a psychologist anyway. It's just that rather than it being about methodologically questioning the robustness of findings and things like that, we're asking, start questioning everything,
Yeah.
Don't just stop at method,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I could have so much more to say about this, but I think we we will need to wrap up. Do we want to talk a little bit about future kind of ideas? So we're still working together and we'll
well, and I think that our working relationship will continue in that way because we have so much to talk about and say on this stuff. But yeah, I think for me at the moment, because my present work is kind of heavily involved in kind of reclaiming a kind of a radical democratic approach in education, and challenging these neoliberal and liberal kind of notions of democracy, which have essentially kind of, depoliticized politics, if that makes sense. But to challenge those inherent political elements. And I do see issues with the psi complex in the construction of those things. So, like, for me, the pressing thing to consider is, and we would have been, we're quite clear in critical psychology, I think, on this, in that we most of the time are challenging the way in which psychology has bolstered and feeds neoliberal capitalism. And we would be critical of that. But we're normally critical of it in the liberal democratic sense of questioning mainstream policy and things like that. But we also have to acknowledge that there is a very strong emergence of right-wing authoritarian and even totalitarian fascist beliefs now that are mobilizing discourse that are, fueled by the psi complex. So if you take, well, in Ireland at the moment, I'm doing research on the far-right protests and libraries for holding drag queen storytime readings a couple of years ago. And if you look at those discourses, they're heavily developmentalist in notions, talking about particular constructions of the child, in this case, the psychologized child, that they make certain notion and mobilize childhood innocence in that sense, that they're not developed enough to understand these issues or to engage with these issues. And part of it too is reflected in these heteroactivist discourses towards the LGBTQ community, where it's not just a defense of beliefs or traditions from this particular cohort or anymore. They are actually mobilizing scientific notions of what gender is, of what race is. And there are plenty of discourses circulating about belief in the inherent biological reality of race differences, which is obviously, as we know, is completely and utterly debunked and has been debunked for a long time. But they are, again, re-engaging in these things with discourses around the inherent deficit of Black minority people's IQs, for example. So we do have to be attendant to those more extreme, I think, political views as well, and what they hold and how these psi-complex infused and psychologizations feed those.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, this is one of the things where I think psychology has a really important role to play because it's being drawn on by not just kind of liberal or neoliberal or, conservative kind of right governance, but exactly with the kind of emergence of far-right political support in the UK. Exactly as you said, we're seeing it picked up on there too. And I think psychology can play a really important role in, if psychology is being treated, including, as I say, quantitative psychologists, if the work is being treated as this objective kind of fact that, should determine entirely our course of action related to issues that are kind of emerging and being debated, psychologists can play a role in positively informing those debates with a social justice orientation. So it would be good to see psychologists, and particularly psychologists who most often do quantitative work, using that kind of expertise and position to be able to argue
absolutely,
towards social justice.
Yeah, and using their expertise to uncover,
yes,
to uncover those injustices as well, which is ultimately the fundamental principle of that quant group mindset too. But yeah, you're right, absolutely.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, cool. Anything else? Final thoughts?
I don't think so. I think, I have loads of thoughts, but the problem is you can't constrain them in the podcast.
Honestly, I could have kept up. There were so many things I thought I need to not, but I've got so much to say. But we'll wrap it up there then. Okay, well, thanks. That is the end of this episode. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.